Story 1.
I worked as a cashier at the Old Maple General Store, a small, historic corner store in a small town in rural Vermont. It was one of those places that seemed to have stopped in time, with wooden shelves creaking under the weight of products and a brass bell that jingled every time the door opened. I've always been a night person, so working the night shift, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., didn't bother me too much. At 26, my routine was simple. Study in the morning, a short nap in the afternoon, and the store in the evening. At the time, I lived alone in a small apartment a few blocks away, and the walk through the cold Vermont night to work was part of what I enjoyed most. It helped me think and clear my head before my shift started. Everything was going normally that October night. The air was colder than usual, and the dry leaves scraped across the asphalt like little whispers. As soon as I started my shift, I did what I always do. I organized the counter, checked the cash register, and replaced some items that had been sold during the day. But as soon as I turned to the row of cookies at the back of the store, something caught my eye. A bag of cookies that I was sure I had just organized was out of place, tilted in an odd way. I frowned, but then shrugged, blaming it on my tiredness. It was the beginning of the shift, but the last few weeks had been heavy with college exams, so it could just be my mind playing tricks. As the hours passed, the store remained silent, except for the occasional sound of the wind whistling outside and the creaking of the door as it was opened by a lone customer. Around 2 in the morning, the calm was interrupted by a subtle noise coming from the end of the canned goods aisle. My eyes narrowed toward the sound, and my heart quickened for a brief moment. I walked there with cautious steps, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that crept up my spine. When I arrived, I saw that some soup cans were out of place, as if they had been pushed off the shelf. I must have bumped into them earlier, I thought, even though I knew I hadn't been there that night. I walked back to the register, trying to stifle my growing discomfort. Minutes later, I heard a slight click coming from the front door, as if someone was trying to open it subtly. I quickly looked at the glass and only saw the reflection of the streetlights and the emptiness of the street. A chill crept up my neck. To keep my head straight, I began to absent-mindedly scan the day's sales records, looking for some task to keep my mind occupied. It was then that I noticed something strange. A recent sales entry for an object that I didn't recognize. Old doll, $0. The sale made no sense, and the fact that it was listed at no cost left a bitter taste in my mouth. The dawn advanced, and the feeling that something was wrong only increased. The silence felt thicker, as if the air around me was thick with dark expectation. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. After all, how many times had I heard about other colleagues who had bouts of anxiety during night shifts? But the strangeness continued when, just before 4 in the morning, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps crossing the cleaning products section, where no one had been since the beginning of the night. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. The hallway was empty, the shelves still and lined up, but something made me stop. On the floor, right in the middle of the hallway, was a worn silver coin, shining in the dim light of the lantern. I immediately remembered a specific customer, Mr. Wheeler, an elderly man who always paid with rare coins and had a collection of stories about his time as an explorer. The problem was that Mr. Wheeler had been dead at least 3 months. The news of his death in a city hospital had come as a shock to the small community, and I myself had attended the wake to pay my respects. I swallowed hard and put the coin in my apron pocket, not sure what to think. The tiredness and strangeness were making me restless, so I went back to the counter and forced myself to focus on the digital clock that marked the time in pulsing red. 4:12. That's when the store door opened with a sudden clang. I looked up, expecting to see a regular customer or perhaps a tired truck driver looking for coffee, but what I found made me freeze. There, framed by the door, was Mr. Wheeler. His tall, stooped figure was exactly as I remembered, in the gray wool beret and brown wool coat he always wore. But there was something different about him. His eyes seemed deeper, like 2 dark wells that reflected the low light in the store. And he didn't give me the usual friendly wave or gap-toothed smile he always gave me. He just looked at me with an expression that was difficult to decipher, something between sadness and urgency. I felt a cold run through my veins, and my mind tried to find some logical explanation. Maybe I was dreaming with my eyes open, a hallucination induced by fatigue. But as he tried to convince me of this, he took a few steps inside, making the wooden floors creak as if he were whispering ancient secrets. My fingers shook slightly as I pretended to touch the cashier's keyboard, but my attention was completely focused on Mr. Wheeler's every move. He approached slowly, without taking his eyes off me, and a peculiar aroma, a mixture of mothballs and damp earth, filled the air. When he reached the counter, he stopped for a moment and opened his hand. Inside it, I saw something that made my heart almost stop. The same silver coin that I had kept in my pocket minutes before. Without saying a word, he placed the coin on the counter, and the metallic sound echoed through the empty store in a way that seemed almost unearthly. "I need my last sale," he murmured in a slurred voice, as if the words were coming from a deep well. My brain was trying to process what was happening, but everything in me was screaming at me to run. Instead, I felt a strange compassion. Local legend had it that, before he passed away, Mr. Wheeler had talked about a special object that he intended to buy, but never got around to doing so. Antique doll. No charge, I remembered, and a wave of shivers ran up my spine. The recorded sale mysteriously made sense now, but in a way I preferred not to understand. I fought the urge to run away and took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Mr. Wheeler, I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, more to myself than to him. But he didn't respond. His dark eyes remained fixed on me for a few seconds, and then, without any sudden movement, he pointed to the shelf behind me. I followed his gaze and saw, with my stomach churning in disbelief, an antique doll that had definitely not been there before. He had a face made of cracked porcelain and eyes that seemed too alive, with long eyelashes and an expression that bordered on sinister. My mind was spinning in a whirlwind of thoughts as I picked up the doll with shaking hands. The silence in the store was so absolute that I could hear my own breathing quicken. "Is that it?" I asked, my voice sounding small and almost childish. Mr. Wheeler only nodded slightly, and a hint of a smile formed on his lips before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Carefully, I placed the doll on the counter, and he touched it with his wrinkled fingertips. The air around us seemed to change. It became lighter, as if the tension had dissipated. He looked at me one last time, and his eyes seemed more serene, almost grateful. Then, in the blink of an eye, he turned around and, inexplicably, disappeared through the door that had never opened. I stood frozen for a few moments, my heart hammering in my chest as my eyes remained fixed on the door. There was no sound of footsteps outside, no breeze to indicate that anyone had left. I walked to the entrance, hesitating before peering out the window. The street was as empty as before, with leaves dancing in the wind and thick darkness engulfing the corners. I went back inside, my mind torn between relief and absolute terror at not being able to explain what had just happened. The doorbell swayed slightly, as if someone had just left, but that only made the silence seem even more eerie. I sat on the teller's bench and looked at the silver coin and the doll on the counter. With hands still shaking, I took the coin, feeling its cold weight against my skin. The inscription on it looked familiar but different, as if something had changed. That was when the first ray of sunlight began to paint the horizon, painting the interior of the store with a soft, warm light. The terror of the night began to slowly dissipate, giving way to a curious sense of peace. Somehow, I knew that Mr. Wheeler had finally found what he was looking for. I spent the rest of the morning tidying up the store in a daze. When my colleague arrived to replace me, I said nothing about what happened, keeping the coin and the experience as my own secret. I never saw the doll in the store again after that day, and the following nights were normal, as if nothing had happened. But every time I smell damp earth or hear the tinkling of the doorbell, a part of me still hopes to see old Mr. Wheeler coming in to collect his latest purchase. Story 2. I have never been a person to believe in supernatural or paranormal things. I've always had my feet on the ground and a logical explanation for everything. I have worked as a financial analyst for 5 years and take the same train every day at 7:15 a.m. to get to the office. It's a routine that has become automatic. I wake up, have coffee, walk to the station, and always take the same carriage. I usually sit by the window because I like watching the city go by while answering some emails on my cell phone. It was one of those normal mornings, about 2 weeks ago, that I started to notice something strange. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, you know? But now, after everything that's happened, I can't stop thinking about it and I need to share it with someone. It all started on an ordinary Monday. I got on the train as usual, sat in my usual seat, and while I was using my cell phone, I felt that uncomfortable feeling of being watched. When I looked up, I saw a man sitting across the hall staring at me. He must have been in his early 40s, wore a very plain gray suit and held a black folder on his lap. What bothered me was not his appearance. He looked like an executive like any other, but his look, it was intense, unblinking, like he was studying every detail of my face. At the time I looked away, a little embarrassed, and tried to concentrate on the cell phone screen. But the feeling of those eyes fixed on me didn't go away. When I looked again, he was still in exactly the same position, watching me with the same intensity. The next day, I tried sitting in a different seat a few rows away. But as soon as the train started moving, there he was again on the other side of the aisle in the seat parallel to mine. This time, in addition to staring at me, he started imitating my movements. When I adjusted the collar of my shirt, he made exactly the same gesture. When I checked the time on my cell phone, it simulated the movement even without having a device in my hands. It was as if he was a distorted reflection of me, copying every little movement I made. I started making some gestures on purpose, just to be sure, scratching my nose, fixing my hair, crossing my arms, and he repeated everything with frightening precision, as if we were in sync. The days passed and the situation only got worse. I tried to change cars, but somehow it was always there. I began to notice other disturbing details. His clothes were always the same. His gray suit didn't have a single different wrinkle or stain, and his expression never changed. It was always that same blank, fixed stare. No one else on the train seemed to notice anything strange. People passed by him normally. Sometimes they even bumped into him as they crossed the corridor. But no one reacted as if there was anything out of the ordinary. I was starting to question my own sanity. Was he working too much? Had the stress finally gotten to me? Last Friday, after more than a week of this torture, I decided it was time to confront this man. I could no longer bear that feeling of being watched and imitated. I gathered all my courage and stood up abruptly from my seat. As expected, he made the same move. I walked purposefully to his place, feeling my heart beating so hard it felt like it was going to explode. My palms were sweaty and my legs were shaking a little, but I needed to get this over with. When I got really close to him, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was something wrong with his eyes. They had no depth at all. They were like two little balls of frosted glass, lifeless. Before I could say anything, an elderly lady who was sitting right behind him asked me if I was okay. She seemed genuinely concerned. I asked her if she didn't see the man in the gray suit sitting there. She looked at the seat I was pointing at, then looked at me with a confused expression and said the seat was empty. Other passengers began to pay attention to our conversation. A guy with headphones took out one of the headphones and confirmed that no one was sitting there. But how so? He was right there in front of me. I could see every detail of him. The perfectly aligned tie knot, the impeccably polished black shoes, the black briefcase on his lap. And the worst part, while everyone looked at me with concern, he was still there, imitating my expression of despair. I felt so upset that I got off the train at the next station, long before my stop. I needed fresh air, I needed to think. I almost ran up the stairs to the station, bumping into people coming down. When I reached the street, I leaned against a wall and tried to take a deep breath to calm down. I took my cell phone out of my pocket with shaking hands and called work, making up some excuse about feeling unwell. I was unable to work in that state. I stood there for a good few minutes trying to process what had happened. Was I having some kind of hallucination? Should I see a psychiatrist? But it all felt so real, so vivid. It was then that I looked across the street and my heart almost stopped. There he was, standing on the opposite sidewalk, looking at me. He wore the same impeccable gray suit, held the same black briefcase, and kept that blank stare fixed on me. I closed my eyes tightly and counted to 10, hoping that when I opened them he wouldn't be there anymore. But when I opened it, not only was he still in the same place, he had assumed exactly the same position as me, leaning against the wall with his cell phone in his hand. A lady passed right in front of him as he was crossing the street, and I could see it clearly. She passed through his body as if he were made of smoke. At that moment, I felt my legs weaken. What the hell was happening to me? I couldn't stand to stay there another second. I started walking quickly, almost running, turning into several streets randomly, trying to lose him. But it didn't matter where I went. When I looked back, there he was, always keeping the same distance, copying my every move. I walked into a crowded cafe thinking that maybe, among so many people, he would disappear. I sat at a table in the back, ordered a coffee with my hands shaking so much that I could barely hold the menu. The waitress looked at me worriedly and asked if I was okay. I must have looked crazy, sweating, shaking, looking nervously everywhere. And it was then that I saw him again, sitting at a table on the other side of the cafe, with an empty cup in front of him, raising it to his lips every time I took a sip of my coffee. Panic took over me completely. I threw some bills on the table and ran out of the cafeteria. I took the first taxi I saw and gave my home address. The whole way, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, hoping to see that lifeless face staring back at me from some other car. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, closed all the curtains. I called my sister crying. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words sounded crazy even to my own ears. She was really worried and said she was coming here. While I waited, I sat on the living room sofa, hugging my knees, trying to convince myself that all of this was a product of my stress, of my imagination. It was then that I heard a noise coming from my room, a soft sound, like muffled footsteps on the carpet. My entire body froze. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I slowly turned my head toward the hallway, and there he was, standing in the doorway of my room, in the same position as me, hugging his knees in the air, floating a few inches off the ground. Those opaque eyes fixed on me, that expressionless face, that impeccable gray suit. I started screaming, really screaming, until my throat hurt. Neighbors came knocking on the door, asking if everything was okay. When I looked back into the hallway, he was gone. I opened the door to the neighbors and my sister, who had just arrived. They went in, searched the entire apartment, but obviously found nothing. This happened 3 days ago. I haven't left the house since then. I resigned from work via email and blocked my boss's calls. My sister is worried, says I need to seek professional help, that I'm having a nervous breakdown. Maybe she's right. But now, as I write this story on my notebook, I can see in the reflection of the screen. He is sitting behind me, typing in the air with his fingers, imitating every word I write. I don't know what else to do. I don't know if I'm going crazy or if there's something really supernatural happening to me. I just know that I can't live like this anymore. If anyone has gone through something similar, please help me. I need to understand what is happening to me before I completely lose my sanity. Story 3. Hi everyone. I need to share something that happened to me a few months ago, and to this day I still can't explain it. My name is Amanda, I'm 32 years old and I work as a graphic designer at an advertising agency here in Curitiba. At the time of the incident, October last year, I was going through a very busy time at work, always staying late due to tight end-of-year deadlines. I've lived alone for 5 years in an apartment in the Agua Verde neighborhood, a very busy and safe area of the city. I always felt calm walking around, even at night, as the streets are well lit and there are a lot of people walking around, even at later hours. It was on a Wednesday that it all started. I had just left the office at around 10 p.m. after finishing an important presentation for a client. I was exhausted, but at the same time relieved to have finished the project. The way home was the same as always. I went down AV República Argentina for about 15 minutes, passed in front of the shopping mall, and then entered the street where my building was located. That particular night, while I was walking distractedly listening to a podcast on my headphones, I had that strange feeling you get when someone is watching you. Do you know when your body just knows? That was exactly it. When I looked across the street, I saw a person standing under a tree. It was a tall figure, wearing a dark hooded coat. What caught my attention was that, even though the street was well lit, it seemed that the shadows around this person were denser, as if the light couldn't reach them properly. At the time, I felt an icy chill running up my spine, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. After all, other people also came home at that time, right? I picked up my pace and tried to focus on the podcast, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. When I arrived at the corner of the mall, I couldn't resist and looked back. The figure was gone. I felt momentary relief until I realized that she was now on the same side of the sidewalk as me, about 50 meters behind. The way he moved was strange. He seemed to glide more than walk, as if his feet were barely touching the floor. I started to break out in a cold sweat. My heart raced in a way I had never felt before. I took the headphones out of my ears right away. I needed to be aware of any noise. The sound of my heels clicking on the asphalt seemed deafening in the stillness of the night, and I could have sworn I heard a kind of low hum coming from that person's direction. The following Thursday, I left work early, at 8 p.m., thinking that this would avoid any awkward situations. But I was wrong. This time, the figure appeared as soon as I left the office building, standing in front of a closed store. What scared me most was that even though I was wearing the same dark coat as the night before, there was something different. The hood was a little lower and you could see part of the face. That's when I felt my blood run cold. There was something familiar about those features, like I knew that person from somewhere, but my brain refused to process exactly where from. It was like trying to remember a dream that is fading from memory. The more I tried to identify it, the more confused I became. And the worst part, the more I looked, the more that face seemed wrong, as if the features were slightly distorted. The following days were a nightmare. I changed my route several times, took Uber on a few days, but nothing helped. The figure always found a way to appear. On Friday, I was halfway there when I saw it reflected in the window of a bakery. This time I was closer, maybe 20 meters, and I could notice more disturbing details. His hands, which protruded slightly from his coat sleeves, were too long, with fingers that seemed to have extra joints. And there was something about the posture, as if the whole body was slightly out of alignment, a few centimeters out of place. At that point, I realized that I was shaking so much that I could barely hold my bag. I went into the first open store I saw, a 24-hour pharmacy, and stayed there for almost an hour, pretending to look for products on the shelves. On Saturday, even though I didn't have to work, I needed to go to the office to get some files that I had forgotten. I chose to go at 2 p.m., thinking I would be safe during the day. Big mistake. The sun was shining. The streets were full of people doing their weekend shopping, but that didn't stop us. The figure was there, standing between two parked cars. And it was at that moment that I noticed something that made me question my own sanity. Even in direct sunlight, that dark density around her remained, as if she carried her own shadow, regardless of the lighting. But the worst was to come. As I passed by, I clearly heard breathing. It wasn't normal breathing, it felt wet, like it was coming from lungs full of liquid. And next to it, a sweet and rotten smell, which reminded me of dead flowers. Sunday was the day I almost lost control. I couldn't sleep well, spending the whole night waking up scared by any noise. When I finally fell asleep, it was almost morning. I woke up around 3 p.m. to a knock on the door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see anyone, but the knocking continued. There were 3 slow, heavy taps, followed by a soft scratch. My entire body froze when I realized I knew this pattern. It was exactly how I used to knock on my grandmother's bedroom door when I was a child. I remained paralyzed, standing in the room for almost 2 hours until the knocking finally stopped. When I found the courage to look out the window, I saw the figure standing in the middle of the street, looking directly at my balcony. And for the first time, even at that distance, I could see his face clearly. It was like being punched in the stomach. The face was a distorted version of my own face, but not like in a mirror. It was as if someone had tried to recreate me from memory and got all the important details wrong. The eyes were too big, the mouth extended a few inches beyond normal, and there was something wrong with the skin, which seemed to have a grainy texture, like an old decaying photograph. But the worst thing was the smile. A wide, sickly smile that showed too many teeth. Teeth that looked like they didn't belong in a human mouth. At that moment, I felt something I had never felt before. A fear so deep it was physical, as if every cell in my body was screaming that this was wrong, that this shouldn't exist. On Monday, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to tell my best friend, Renata, everything. She is a psychologist and has always been the voice of reason in my life. When I finished reporting everything, I expected her to tell me it was stress, imagination, or even that I needed to seek professional help. But her reaction scared me even more. She was silent for a long time, her face becoming increasingly pale. Then he told me something that made my world collapse. His grandmother, who was a medium, used to talk about mirror shadows, entities that choose a person and start copying them, becoming more and more similar to their target until they succeed. Take your place. According to her grandmother, they are attracted to people who are going through moments of great loneliness or stress. That night was different. I returned home early, still thinking about the conversation with Renata, when I noticed something strange. There was no one on the street, no cars passing, no pedestrians, no sounds of the city. It was as if I had entered a bubble of silence. And then I heard footsteps behind me, footsteps that exactly imitated the rhythm of mine. When I stopped, the footsteps continued for another 2 seconds before stopping as well. My heart was racing so fast I thought I was going to pass out. Slowly, I turned around. The figure was less than 10 feet away from me. The hood had fallen, revealing not only the face but also the hair, which was identical to mine except that it looked like it had been cut with a dull knife. Our breathing was synchronized, and when I raised my right hand in an involuntary protective gesture, it made exactly the same movement like a distorted mirror. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I don't know if it was survival instinct or pure desperation, but I started running like I had never run before. I could hear that thing coming behind me, its steps now completely out of sync with mine, as if it had given up imitating and gone hunting. The smell of rotting flowers grew stronger by the second. I turned onto one street, then another, without really thinking about where I was going. In a moment of lucidity, I remembered that the neighborhood church was open late for prayers. I changed my route toward her, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. When I looked back, the figure was so close that I could see details I wished I hadn't. Small insects crawling inside its translucent skin, and a strange movement in its neck, as if the bones were constantly rearranging themselves. I skidded into the church, almost falling on the front steps. There were some people praying in the front pews and a priest arranging some books on the altar. The contrast between the normality of the scene and the horror he was experiencing was surreal. I threw myself onto one of the back benches, panting, looking frantically at the door. The figure appeared at the entrance, but stopped, She stood there, standing on the threshold, as if there was an invisible barrier. His face, my face, contorted into an expression that mixed anger and pain. The priest must have noticed something, because he started walking towards the door. Before he got there, the figure retreated, blending into the shadows of the night. It was the last time I saw her. I spent the next few weeks in a state of total alert. I changed my routine completely. I asked for a transfer to the morning shift at work. I started attending church regularly, even though I had never been very religious before, and I never walked alone at night again. Renata helped me research more about the subject, and we discovered similar stories from different cultures, stories of creatures that copy people, each with its own particularities, but all with the same sinister objective. Some people said they were demons, others spoke of interdimensional beings. There were even those who argued that they were government experiments that went wrong. I never figured out exactly what that thing was, but I learned to live with the fear that one day it might return. Today, 6 months later, I still have nightmares about that face, my face, but not exactly mine. Sometimes, when I'm home alone, I hear those 3 knocks followed by a scratch, but I refuse to open the door. I installed security cameras throughout the apartment and always keep a light on at night. Maybe it sounds like paranoia, but after what I've experienced, I prefer to err on the side of caution. The most disturbing thing is that since that night in church, I've started to notice small changes in old photos of myself, subtle details that seem different, as if that thing had managed to alter not only the present, but also fragments of my past. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened, but one thing is for sure, I never look at reflections the same way again, and I always double-check when I see my own shadow on the wall.